thank you. It is really nice. It was like coming home when I came back into the courtyard. I was like, oh, I remember when I went through the Windows training here. And one of the things for me that was really wonderful is for me, sexual assault and domestic violence movement. A lot of times we're very compartmentalized and we work in silos. And having been in a rape crisis center where about 65% of the clients we served were also domestic violence and partner violence survivors, we never saw any difference between the two. And so we wanted to be trained, and when we heard about Windows, we were like, that's perfect. Of course we need to be trained. Of course we need to bring this to our center. We're not a shelter. We're not doing the exact same things as in DV, but this is something that the survivors we're serving need. And so as I understand, we were the first rape crisis center only standalone rape crisis center that ever had leaders that were able to get trained through Windows. So I'm so thankful for that, because it really does, and it did, enhance the type and philosophy of services that we wanted to give. So,
I'm so sorry, I didn't pass out your handout for people to take notes.
Yes.
So
I'll tell you just a little bit in terms of, I guess I should have said it when the first one was on, I call this compassionate creation, because for me, one of my mentors, a woman named Sharon Lushin, that was one of my professors in my program, talked about that when we are wearing that helper hat, right, when we're someone who's there to facilitate and to encourage the healing and create a safe space for someone else's healing process, that we are to be a compassionate witness, right? That we don't have to fix it, we don't have to rescue anyone, we don't have to make it all better, we don't have to have all the answers, but that each and every one of us needs a compassionate witness. Someone who says, I can witness the pain and the suffering and what you've been through and how you've responded to it, not with the answers or not advice, but truly with compassion, with a sense of, I get why that was your response. I see the burden you've carried. I see your suffering. It's not too much for me. I don't have to overcome it. I don't have to make it go away. I don't have to see you even get through it. I can be in that moment with you and be present with you. And so I wanted to give you some of the resources, because absolutely I want to let you know, even in the title, I called it Compassionate Creation, because of that my mentor talking about being a compassionate witness always stayed with me. And I think when I think of the art that we do through Windows, it really is about bringing that compassionate creation as a force, trauma-informed and art. And so the resources that I have here today are some of the places where I've received a lot of training and information on trauma-informed care. Truly, the first place is from feminist therapy, but you can't call things feminist therapy. So to get funding, really trauma-informed care and those philosophies come straight out of the 60s and 70s in the feminist therapy movement. And so it's important for me to talk about the sisterhood that started that, the survivor-centered ways that DV and SA started our work in the movement, and now we have more of sort of a larger network that calls it trauma-informed, and there's some more information that you can find from those resources. So when we think about healing from any type of abuse, it's important for us to understand, right, that no one interaction or report or interaction with a person is going to bring closure, right? So with trauma-informed work, we start from that vantage point that, of course, the people that we're seeing have experienced trauma, period, right? We know that from a very sort of diagnostic point of view, 50 to 90% of folks who have experienced any form of interpersonal violence have symptoms that meet sort of the terminology and the labeling sorts of things that we talk about from post-traumatic stress disorder or acute stress disorder. But what I'm going to tell you today is when I talk about trauma-informed care and the whole trauma-informed movement, we're not talking about it from a diagnostic, external labeling perspective. We're talking about the very real experiences that folks have that create a normal response, right? That we respond, and our brain and bodies and spirits respond very strongly to something that is absolutely wrong and that is coming from an external source. So what we know, though, is that as people are trying to seek help, they also re-experience trauma, right? Even just the fact of telling someone, coming forward, having to even call it what it is. When you talked about your client saying the first time, like, no, that's not what's going on, right? We know that that is a normal response, right? To want to minimize, push it away, deny, not have it be real because it's so horrible to take it in. So we really want to think about how we can create a safe place for us to access, right, the parts of that experience that have created the trauma and therefore process that and move through it. So when we think about trauma-informed, we know that it actually begins with a set of assumptions. And so what you'll hear from me today is not sort of a, this is what you do first and next, and this is a step-by-step process. For myself as a feminist therapist, in my private practice, I see all survivors of child sexual abuse, sexual assault, and intimate partner violence, teens and adults, and that's my entire practice. And so when I'm doing this work, I start from that assumption, right, that the person in front of me is the expert on their own experience. I can never know as much or even hope to know as much about how they've responded and why that was normal for them, and I can only sit from a place of facilitating, right, a process with some information that I can give, right, and that whole process is about that empowerment. It's really a philosophy rather than a set of techniques, and so that's what I want to put out there first and foremost, is it's sort of helping shift the way we think about the sorts of responses we may even see from folks as they're doing the workshop, so that we can give more information and create it in an environment that's very safe. And one of the things I want to say is there's lots of expertise in the room. So the fact that I'm up here doesn't mean like I've crossed some finish line and I know everything at all. I'm always learning, and I know I'm going to gain a lot by being a part of the workshop we'll do today. I've done Journey Footprints before, but I think the fact of the matter is each and every one of you bring a level of expertise to this, and you're already probably doing trauma-informed work, right? Because you love this movement and you're doing the work. So I hope that this can add to that. So I like to let people know sort of where this is sort of situated philosophically, right? Oftentimes we're handed things, especially in a world where rationality and cognitive behavioral models and things like that, evidence-based models, and we started to hear that terminology, right, to get funding, are very much based in a very kind of patriarchal, male-dominated sort of ideology that says rational and cognitive, those are the things that you can count on. The facts, be logical, right? Don't come from that emotional place. You must be PMSing. All the ways that we denigrate anything that's connected with wisdom and the feminine and all of those sorts of things. And I don't believe that those are essential qualities. Gender is a very fluid thing. So I'm coming from a place of saying, rather than denigrate one and uphold the other, we have to, in order to be mindful, in order to be in a place of our best decision making, we have to use both facts and logic, but we also need to use the emotional realm, the ways that we feel, our intuitive self. And so I like to show what the sort of the assumptions behind some of the philosophies. And so when I look at this, really we're looking at sort of the ways that clients and folks that we've served in the movement have been met with all different sorts of ways of treatment, right? So the medical model is one where we see people calling it sort of doctor-patient, and there's someone who has all the expertise and the knowledge, and they're going to bestow that to you, right? They have a plan for you, and that's when we see treatment models. And I think this is where we have to be careful in terms of the fact that we do work that is time limited, that is limited in funding, and so sometimes we have to go by a curriculum, and we have to do a certain number of steps with a certain number of people in a certain number of time, and then turn in certain numbers to get the money, right? And I think what we have to remember is that that can create a treatment model, right? Where this person and that person, who have two very different experiences, who are having two very different responses to trauma, are expected to go through the steps. Well, we're at week 6 in this group, and so we have to be doing this, right? That's a treatment model. And it has to be, by nature, directive, right? Top down, right? So the facilitator is the expert, and I'm telling you where you should be in that model at a certain time. And we have to be very careful, because those models very much are sort of opposite of what trauma-informed would tell us we need to be, right? It doesn't make them wrong, right? We can get a lot. I've written curriculums and used curriculums, but I think we have to be careful of where the bias behind it, right? Oftentimes when we're using those models, we don't talk about that they're not value-free. No model is value-free. So what I'm telling you is the bias behind trauma-informed. Then we have cognitive behavioral models, and we definitely want to look at what are the thoughts, right? What are the ways that, how we're taught to think about ourselves, the messages that abusers, the messages that the violence itself has taught us, the messages from our family of origin, all of those ways we think about ourselves is important, right? And then that leads us to act. And we want to dissect that, we want to explore that, we want to have the time, that safe space in workshops to explore that. but leaving out the piece, right, that your intuitive self, that your instinct, that your gut reaction to something is somehow not part of the process, right? We have to be very wary of that. That's important for us to think about. Humanistic and experiential models, obviously it's where using art as a healing tool came from, and I think there's a lot to be learned in terms of humanistic models, looking at the personal experience, and we want to incorporate that. Those led into person-centered and human validation models. Definitely person-centered was something that had linkages with what was happening in that same time period. In psychotherapy, we had the Rogerian type of person-centered stuff, and we also had the uprising of survivors, starting hotlines in their basement and starting underground ways that people could stay in shelters in one another's homes. So survivor-centered models came from, and at the same time grew within that movement. So then we get to trauma-specific and trauma-informed, and I think this is where we're looking at, we need the information that we have, the newest research, the best information we have about how our bodies and minds respond to trauma. Because for the longest time, we actually didn't even have sexual assault or domestic violence listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual as a reason for trauma, right? Child sexual abuse is still not there. And so you can thank a feminist that even domestic violence and sexual assault are even listed as reasons for trauma in the DSM. They went to task with the men of the American Psychiatric Association, because at that time the people who had decided was a panel of all men. And so they went to task with them and said, this absolutely is a legitimate reason for trauma. And actually what we know now, and I'll talk about this a little more, is that interpersonal violence actually creates the longest standing trauma responses. More than natural disasters, more than terrorist attacks, more than having a limb being dismembered, more than a carjacking, more than being shot. All of these things, interpersonal violence of sexual and domestic violence, we know creates trauma responses that are more long-lasting than any other forms of trauma. So to leave them out is to say, your experience is invisible, right? And what we're saying in trauma-informed is, not only is your experience visible to me, I can hold that with you, right? I can bear witness to it, right? And I can give and empower you with as much information as I have and with as many people on your team to allow you to heal and move through that. And then we have other models, feminist, social construction, and relational models, that I think in terms of continuing in that spectrum of less directive and more peer-driven recovery and peer support models, and then of course 12-step and self-help models. And we know that our clients are coming to us having used and having interacted with everything from that very medicalized model, right? Especially if they showed up at a hospital or they had a DART exam or whatever else, all the way through using some of the 12-step and self-help models while they're in programs with us. So we want to be aware, right, of sort of that whole spectrum of philosophies that they're exposed to. Trauma-informed kind of sits right in that center to much less directive end of things, because we can be sort of a place, right, that holding, safe holding environment where someone can sit with the real feelings, with the thoughts, and not have them judged, and have a space to actually explore them. So I really wanted to juxtapose, and I know there's a lot of words on these slides, but I'm hoping it's something that we can take away. I do a lot of work on the impact of oppression, so looking at how sexism, racism, classism, heterosexism, ableism, anti-immigrant sentiment, all of the ways that we create, right, marginalized groups that are disadvantaged and prioritize and a sense of an advantage, unearned benefits for other groups, and how that is very much mimicked, right, in sexual and domestic violence. So when we look at violence and oppression, right, it doesn't occur in a vacuum. It occurs within the context of that individual. And so one of the ways that I think art can address that is because of the fact that through the Windows workshops, we convey a sense that it doesn't matter, right? Your identity has nothing to do with whether you can do this or not, right? You absolutely are capable. And that identity, especially when you've been made to feel targeted based on that identity, right? Made vulnerable, taken advantage of due to that identity, art can be such a way to say, here is something that you are absolutely capable of, that there is power in your creation, in your voice, in your expression. And that's a way that art really, as a healing tool, conveys something very different than that sense of you're being targeted based on who you are, right? Because we know that's what abusers very much convey. that victimization and oppression depend on myth, right, not fact. And I think one of the things that is so powerful in creation is that it is about truth, right? It is about being able to uncover those layers of all the manipulation and deception that abusers use in order to find that person's truth, that survivor's truth, right? Not the one that we want them to find, right? Not the words or the way we want them to tell their story, but their own narrative, right? And that both are, power and control in terms of domestic violence, in terms of oppression, are about power over, right? So taking away control from someone. And compassionate creation is about not having someone dictate that to you, right? Not taking your power away, but being able to have the freedom to share or not share, right? We're going to talk about the ways that the choices we give in Windows workshops really convey that. Both violence and oppression have a very traumatic impact. And art, what we know as a mode of expression, when someone is able to process in a safe place emotions, we know that trauma symptoms decrease, right? So things like hyper-vigilance, things like having flashbacks, things like intrusive thoughts of the abuser, things like messages coming up, or those sort of like the old recording in your head telling you what that person said over and over again, that those things actually measurably decrease when you have a place, a safe place to funnel that emotional processing, right? Both change self-concept and identity, and again, really reclaiming a sense of positive identity. I can do this. Look what I've created. Look at what my voice did. Look at how it touched someone else across the table from me. All of those things start to create a more positive sense of self. Being able to look at the way that we are able to instill, right, even just the psychoeducation, and all that means is just information that actually creates a strong, positive psychological effect. So when we do psychoeducation, we're able to impart information that can start to change that worldview that, well, this is just what happens to me, or all I'm good for is sex, or I'll never be in a safe situation, right? That all of those old messages can start, that worldview can start to shift because of the environment we're creating, and that we're allowing someone to practice being in that environment. And both really send a message about the worth of the individual. And definitely what we know is that the support we give, the relaxation, literal relaxation, and the stages of relaxation that the body goes through, right? And then being able to have that expression really conveys a sense that things can be different. So what we know is the tactics of abusers, all of the things we know from isolation, minimizing, denying, and blaming, threats, violence, economic and emotional abuse, all of those things are the same things that we use to oppress, right? We see them in racism, we see them in heterosexism, we see them in ableism. We want to be able, through our workshops also, to make sure that those sorts of things, the ways that people are targeted, are things that can be talked about in our workshops as well. And we want to make sure that we're aware of how those things can be triggering. So I'm going to talk a bit about trauma, handling disclosures, and also the crisis intervention piece. That how do we use the aspects of trauma? And just to overview, I'm going to talk a little bit about trauma experiences, because to be trauma informed, we really do want to have a strong sort of a handle on what the real response to trauma is, right? And it may be something that we want to incorporate. I know for our groups, one of the first things we always did was give a little primer on what trauma is, so that if someone was triggered actually during the workshop, they could understand what was happening. And then we also talked about making a plan as far as co-leading or things like that, so that if someone had a very strong trigger, one of the leaders could go over and talk with that person about what was happening during that trigger, not to stop it, right, but to just reinforce that they were having a normal response. So we're going to talk about experiences, the response, and then some of the phases. So what we know is that trauma experiences include intense fear, horror, and they are experiences that are outside of our normal range, right? Our mind, body, and spirit really are not equipped to be attacked, to be violated in the ways that we are during sexual and domestic violence. And it is an attack on bodily integrity, life. You feel like a sense of a loss, maybe a loss of life is imminent. And what we know is that our brain is equipped to respond very intensely to that. So if, as I was up here presenting, right, and I am a fairly, comfortable presenter, and all these smiling faces sitting here looking at me, if someone were to barge into this courtyard and make a lot of racket and run through that door, before I could ever have a conscious thought, I would probably be crouching, maybe even yelling, right? Making an actual noise and crouching down maybe behind the table. Before I could ever think, oh, I think that person's coming to hurt us, or I'm scared, or maybe they have a weapon. Before I could think any of that, right? My body would be responding. That's a trauma response, right? Have you ever had something happen and you were so startled, or you ended up somewhere else and you went, whoa, how did I do that, right? That's a trauma response. Our body and our brain is equipped to try to keep us safe in situations that feel dangerous, right? So that's something that we can explain, right, and make sure that folks understand that the very strong, intense responses that sometimes are puzzling, they're confusing, we don't understand why we have them, well, why do I keep doing this? These are trauma responses. And what we know is that, as I said before, interpersonal violence creates some of the strongest responses as far as trauma. So what we know is that trauma is a brain response, and due to my empowerment through Windows, I'm going to draw up here for you. So if this is our head here, right? We've got our brain, our fabulous brain here. And right here in the back is our brain stem, or our hindbrain. And that is the part of the brain that lights up when we're in trauma, right? That is the part of the brain that says, something is wrong, sound the alarm, we need to get to safety, something has to happen to change what's going on, right? There's an overwhelm. During that process, this frontal lobe, right? And our frontal lobe is the part that is organized, it plans, it helps us focus, it maintains concentration, right? Says, we're not doing math problems right now. Attend to whatever is possibly interfering with our continuing to live and be safe, right? So that is why concentration, focus is broken. It's why giving someone a set of directions and having them do a step-by-step process is not appropriate in trauma-informed care, right? It's why when you follow up with someone and you say, well, these were the 3 things you were supposed to do before we have our next case management meeting, and here's the form you were supposed to fill out, and you're supposed to get the kids in school, and you were going to do this, and the person's like, right? Can we go over that again, right? Because the fact is, the brain is saying, no, in order to protect you, right, we need to make sure that first things come first, survival. So one of the things to remember is that a trauma response is about, have people heard these words before? Okay, but I really, really want us to come away today with adding fight, flight, or freeze. It's one of the things we almost never hear, but it is absolutely just as natural a response to trauma as anything else. When people do the, why does she stay, why does she stay? That staying, right? That sometimes that paralysis, that sense of not being able to move into or make a decision or move to the next chapter or even figure out what to do the next day, the next hour, is a normal trauma response, right? The brain, that alarm system is saying, we need to take care of how violated, right? How unsafe, how dangerous your environment, your context is right now. And so what we get is that chronic arousal, right? Chronic stress. And that alarm system, right, and all of the research prior was often done on shell shock and war fatigue and things like that with veterans. And that's how we got information on trauma. What we know is with intimate partner violence, the consistent terrorism that people are living within, right, and that abuse creates that same chronic stress and arousal. So what we want to do is really to be cognizant that people are in a very consistent and prolonged trauma response. And that's going to impact concentration and focus, and oftentimes the main thing is about avoiding, right? I want to avoid anything that turns that stress response back on, right? That may be sitting down and focusing in a Windows group, right? Some of that gets reactivated. So what we're going to do in our trauma-informed response is to convey that that's normal, right? To give some information about it, and then to respond in ways that help to decrease, right? Not fix or take away, but respond to it in a compassionate way, and we hope over time decrease that response so that it's not disruptive to that person. So trauma-informed care, some of the tenets that I've already talked about. One is that the survivor is the expert on their own experience, right? That we cannot tell them what they've experienced or how it's going to impact them or what their healing response will be or what their trauma response will be. We need to get that information from each individual. We want to look at their ways of coping with curiosity rather than judgment. And this is a quote that I really love. This was from a speaker at AWBW Long Beach, and I know a few of you go to that. Father Boyle came, and one of the reasons why we asked him to come, he's the leader and the director of Homeboy and Homegirl Industries. And they're internationally known as the best gang intervention program in the world. And the reason why we asked him there is because what we know is almost 100% of gang-involved individuals come from homes where there was domestic violence, sexual assault, and sexual abuse. Hands down, right? So if we're not working with gang intervention, if we're not working with gang-involved families, we're not reaching survivors, right? So we asked Father Boyle and we said, we need to collaborate, we want to make sure we're working with you. And one of the quotes that he said when he spoke to us was just really dead-on trauma-informed. And that is that rather than standing in judgment of the survivor in front of me and how they carry their burdens, right? So what are their coping skills? What have they been doing? Oh, they've been drinking. Oh, they've been gangbanging, whatever that is. How they carry their burdens, I must stand in awe of what they carry, right? That is trauma-informed, right? And for me, it's why I do this work. It truly is why I do this work, that I am inspired every day by the level of strength and courage, right? And every moment that I see, right, those responses, no matter what the survival skill that comes out of that response, I see that as evidence of someone who is being self-protective, who's been creative and adaptive to a situation that is almost unlivable, right? And so that is the philosophy of trauma-informed care. So one of the things that I think is so empowering is how we use this in so many of the workshops. Specifically in the I am writing exercise that we're going to practice today, or that we're going to get involved with, really that sense of being able to hear out loud, right, your thoughts, your beliefs, your feelings reflected in a non-judgmental way is so powerful, right? How many of us have had that experience, right? It's rare, it's few and far between, right? How many of us still have the best friend that's like, well, I told you, right? This was what you should have done, right? And you're like, oh, thanks a lot. I guess I won't tell you next time, okay? Right? How many spaces in our life are truly safe and non-judgmental and just reflect back, right? Here's what I'm hearing from you, right? Here's a space where your words, your thoughts, your beliefs, who you are, is taken wholeheartedly and is safe with me, right? And that process is so centering, right? It's something that sometimes we don't get enough of just in general, but especially when we're dealing with trauma, that is such a needed thing. So we're going to go through some of the tenets. These are the main tenets of trauma-informed care. That it is collaborative, supportive, and skill building, that it promotes empowerment, that it creates safety, consistency, and choice, as much as possible that we avoid re-traumatization, and that we try to provide as much as possible an individualistic response based on that person's identity, their circumstances, and their own needs. And I know it's a tall order, right? It's a very tall order. But I think one of the things we can do is that we can use the absolute platform and the foundation that Windows gives us. And this is just to really enhance and bring to mind that we're probably already doing so many of these things. And if we bring it into our consciousness, what it does is it lets us enhance that, right? It lets us know also that we're doing the right thing. And it gives us that sense of encouragement to keep moving forward with that. And we want to incorporate these things into the workshop. So I'm just going to take each one and talk a little bit about becoming trauma-informed. The bigger part of this is that being truly trauma-informed is an entire organization. Yes. Okay? And I know I went and the reason why I trained at the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence is because I had done a training with all of the executive directors for the state of California rape crisis centers. And it was interesting. It was interesting, right? I mean, and that's not to put down any EDs in the room, but I understand there needs to be the focus on the administration, and this is what we have to do, and the funders are saying this, and this is what we need. right? But every part of an organization needs to get on board, and not just in name, but walk the talk, right? And I've seen many an organization that says, oh, we're feminist, oh, we're this, oh, we're that, and in practice, right? In practice, what that means is the entire organization, and we're very hierarchical still in our movement, even though we're a movement started by grassroots feminists. I will never understand that for the life of me, but that is where we are. We're still in that. Most places are not, run by a collective or an implementation committee or things like that. So it means that to be trauma informed, our board of directors needs to know what that means and to be on board with those philosophies, right? It means that our administration needs to be on board with those philosophies, that our directors, our managers, that our frontline staff, that the folks answering our hotline, that every intern that comes through, every volunteer gets that in training, that each and every person can give you a snippet of what trauma is and why it's normal and why it's not to be judged, and give a definition of that very succinctly, right, and feel comfortable with it, right, and that training is a part up front, and that a board member and your newest volunteer can sit side by side and get that same training, right? It flattens things, and you can see my bias, right, obviously. I feel strongly about these things, and
You're not alone.
thank you. So when we think about that, though, the service delivery systems, because why? All of the rules of the organization, right, come from all of those places within the organization. Not only how the rules come down of what happens in the shelter and who does what and how the organization is handled and what policies and procedures are, but also the people that are implementing those policies and procedures, the folks that are facilitating the groups. If all of that isn't trauma informed, what you get is you come to group and you have the little safe space, and then you move away or you get back into shelter that night and the rules are super re-traumatizing and triggering, and the ways that you're responded to in that environment are super triggering. And then you come back to group and you've got to decompress from all that triggering, right? And that makes your jobs harder. So I just want to say I'm there with you. I am there with you. So when we think about that, those modifications, we really wanted to learn how, if we can, and that's something, like I said, we really tried within the rape crisis movement to start from that place of administration has to be on board with this, and it needs to be brought wholeheartedly to every organization. So, to start with the first sort of tenet, collaborative, supportive, and skill building, that we really want to avoid being directive. As much as possible, if we can come from a place of what are the strengths that we already know. And one of the things that I always say is that I understand that each and every person that walks through our doors is already creative, extremely courageous, and they've made major adaptations in order to even be with us, right? And so it's important for us to convey that right off the bat. And I think that's something obviously that in all of our introductions for Windows workshops, in the way that we create that space and the things we say. And I always think we can't reiterate that enough, right? How do we bring some of that philosophy into every aspect of our organization? We also have to be aware, right, of ourselves, right? That we are in a culture within our movements of burnout, right? Of working ourselves way too much, way too many hours. If you don't do one more thing, you're not there for survivors, right? We cultivate, maybe if that's not said to us, that is there under the surface, right? And I know that's there for me in working in this movement. That we're oftentimes feeling a sense of having to rescue or do our job in a way that's very hurried and run to the next thing. And it's important that we don't adopt some of that all or nothing, black or white thinking, right? That someone has to get to a certain place or do a certain thing or admit a certain thing or get out of denial. That we really just meet each person where they are and give someone flexibility to make choices, right? So that if someone really has to just sit for the entire workshop and cry, that was a place that we want to say, how amazing that you listened to what your body needed right then. Thank you for being in group with us. Thank you for modeling. That was really strong, right? That's trauma-informed. And that we learn to let go of that need to control, right? And have that pressure of, but they didn't do it, but they didn't learn, she was the one that really needed that message that we were going to do today, right? And we do feel that, and it's not a bad thing. It's out of well-intention, right? It's why we're in this movement. That we want to think about building the skill that each and every survivor we work with has been stripped of, which is very accurately connecting to what they need and being able to vocalize that, right? Being able to show or tell us, this is what I need in this moment, right? Checking in with themselves. And it's something I have to practice a lot, right? Is really checking in. Am I caregiving for someone else? Am I doing what the authority figure in the room thinks I'm supposed to do? Or am I really checking in with what I need in this moment, right? And what we know is that the kind of trauma, the hyper-vigilance, the ways of always being in chronic stress, this alarm that's going off, right? That's telling us fight, flight, or freeze, right? That sometimes keeps us stuck, is in opposition to that, to just taking a moment to center and think about, what is it I need in this moment? Why am I feeling so upset? Or why am I feeling so resistant? Why am I so angry today? To be able to be in touch with that. That we want to really think about empowerment. And I know we all know this, but one of the things that I always point out is that manipulation and deception are the most powerful tools that abusers and perpetrators have. And they use them at all times. Even when they're being nice, they're manipulating, right? We know that that's just as much a part of the abuse, and we all know this, right? But I think being able to again and again experience that idea of true contrary action, right? Acting in opposition to what your abuser trained you were worthy of, right? So we really want to make sure we're giving information. So when something as simple as a change of group, right? The time of the group is changing, or the room, or whatever else. Give information. Why does that need to happen, right? So we don't want to be the ones that are from on high giving the information, or this is how we're doing things today, or this rule is this way. Well, why, right? Give information. And what we know is it takes 4 to 6 times under normal circumstances for us to absorb new information. When trauma is involved, imagine, right? I've heard anywhere from the range to 8 to 10 times more than in normal circumstances, right? So then we're talking 8 to 10 times of 4 to 6 times. We're talking a lot of information giving, and that's a way of empowerment. What's changing and what's not. And oftentimes when we see someone who is, quote, resisting, right? Or that child in group who's acting out and just not able to engage in the ways that we would hope they could, that they're really often experiencing some form of loss, right? A loss of a sense of competence, right? I can't do this, right? I'm not able to, or I'm not talented enough, or the kid next to me is drawing so well, or whatever it is. And we want to figure out, how do we replace and soften those losses? How can we empower someone in that moment to understand, right, that their feelings about it are normal, and that their response is absolutely honored in that space, and to think about what it is they might need to ask for, right? What it is that you need to feel safe again. We also want to start to think about what the vulnerabilities might be. So in each of our groups, some of the things that could be triggering, right? I know in almost all of the groups, especially the overlap for us with folks that were child sexual abuse survivors as well, we really had a lot of triggers around journaling, right? Because when people journaled, it got taken, and that's how it got found out that something was happening, right? Or a perpetrator would take or steal diaries or tear pages out so that there was no evidence, right? All of these things were happening on a regular basis. So we want to have forethought about what could be triggering, right? And we can mention those things, right? That when I say the word journal, that people may already have a response to that, right? And introducing it, we start to validate and normalize some of the thoughts that are already popping for people. And when we do that, it gives space in the room that if someone was sitting there thinking, well, I'm totally crazy, everybody else is sitting here journaling, and I am freaking out, I don't know what to do, I feel like I'm going to have a panic attack, because all I can see is that perpetrator's face and how they stole my journal, all of those things, right? And how much I got in trouble and got punished for it. What might be that trigger? And also that if we say that something's going to be a safe space where someone can share, that we follow through on that, right? Being aware, though, of promises, right? Promises that this will make it all better, or that there's, you won't feel that anymore, or any of those things. And also thinking about the ways that we sort of get defensive, right? Our own accountability. Because this is, again, that way of creating safety and consistency. We may be the first model of someone who consistently supports, right? Of someone who consistently believes, of that person who consistently doesn't judge. And that's hard, right? We're not perfect. But that when we get into a place where maybe we're having a real burnout day and we're having a hard time, right, with the person in group who again doesn't participate or who shows up late or whatever else, right? And with grappling with that policy and how to deal with where that person may be coming from and trying to meet them where they are. being accountable, right? That if we do misstep, or we become directive, or we get sort of harsh with someone who we think is sort of resisting what we're doing in a group, to really think about, being able to come back and say to that person, I'm sorry for the way I addressed you earlier. I'm hoping we can talk about that. How are you feeling? Checking in with that person. And really explaining the why, because one of the things we know is that change itself is a trigger for trauma, right? Because it's that idea of unknown, of I can't control it, it just changed and it was out of my hands. So change itself, even if we think it's a great change, we're moving to a new building, everybody's going to have new beds or whatever, right? And we think, fantastic, change is a trigger, right? So we're all on board. Change is that event. The transition is the emotional process that each individual has to go through to get to a place to invest. And that may take any length of time, right? So we want to know the difference between change, right, which is often directed and said, some person makes a decision and the change happens, right? We know that happens sometimes with if our higher-ups, they make a decision, this is what's happening, and then you just, okay, I guess I just have to go with that, right? That's the new policy, I guess I have to be on board. But there's an emotional process that happens after that. And so we want to be able to connect with what are the losses, what are the ways that that change could trigger the survivors we're working with. So when we're thinking about re-traumatization, we want to acknowledge the specific trauma response that someone's having. Again, one of the things that I've found very helpful is actually showing and talking about the trauma response, even just a little bit each group, right? Adapting or finding ways to talk about, there may be pieces of this where something comes up. What might that look like, right? Even having sometimes during the final closing go-around, have people say, was there a point where it got hard or there was something that came up for you? And what you find is that there's this wonderful validation around the room that there were pieces for each person that were really triggering. And that the validation is, that happened to you too, right? That's normal. That's a part of what we're going through. That's okay to bring that here next time. And so what you find is that you get more empathy, right? And this is where I find trauma-informed to really work when you're doing communal living, right? Which we know is where often our response to it is policies, rules, right? There was an infraction and you've got to talk to this person and all of these sorts of things. What we find is the kinds of struggles and power struggles and trauma triggers that occur in communal living in shelters decreases when there's empathy about trauma between survivors, right? So if a survivor can see another survivor's burst of anger or the ways that they're interacting as we're triggering each other somehow, something's going on here, right? That can de-escalate situations in a lot of places. One of the things that the Center for Trauma-Informed Care and the board, I'm on the National Center for Mental Health, Domestic Violence, and Trauma. And one of the things we've worked on is going into places, and I didn't go, but my colleagues and I came up with the curriculum to go into a center that was all a juvenile detention for teen girls. No doubt, they said the numbers were something like 92% were survivors, right, of dating violence, intimate partner violence, and child sexual abuse. We thought it was probably closer to 100. And what we knew was that some of the ways that rules and policies were done because of the communal living environment, the structure was triggering to folks. And so we went in and said, okay, we understand staffing is short, time is short, you have to run people through certain programs, they have to get to X amount of groups, and they have to have X amount of schooling hours each day. We get all that. But what we have to also acknowledge is you're having a tremendous impact on staff time and a tremendous impact on how people, the fights and the things that are breaking out because people are so triggered, right? So we said, well, what's one of the triggering places, right? Showers, bathroom time, right? That idea of one, disrobing, of having other people in the mix when that's happening, of, all of the ways that triggered lots of different things. Even just a very set time for breakfast, and that there was a structured time, and if you didn't make it, then you didn't get to come, or you couldn't use certain utensils, or there were certain rules about the cabinets. All of those things started to become triggers. And we talked about, can we find a range of time? Can people select which time they take their showers? Is there a way to make sure that there's someone there to debrief if someone gets triggered? Can we put certain groups before, right, that time, right? So it's not the first thing in the morning and there's been no relaxation exercise. There's been nothing to debrief. So all of those things, right, anticipating when trauma could come up can really be a part of creating a trauma-informed environment. And then we also have to look at ways, one of the other things we saw was that a lot of these girls were going to 12-step meetings. And one of the things we saw is after 12-step meetings, a lot of fights broke out. And one of the things we saw was that folks were being, put into sort of theories that talked about, well, what, clean up your side of the street, right? Smash your ego. What's your part of the problem? Do a fourth step and understand your part in it. If you were out there doing sex work, then you brought it on. You put yourself in a dangerous situation. Why were you using? All of these things, right? And because they were more of a self-help model, you heard sort of the dynamic that was there. And it's not that, again, I'm not anti-12-step and I'm not anti those theories, but we have to look at that some parts, some of the bias within those is very much anti-trauma informed, and it can be very triggering, very blaming. And so we want to look at some of the things we're using, some of the curriculum, some of the ways that those things could be re-traumatizing to the survivor. And we want to consider each survivor's identity, just briefly. And how am I on time? Because I didn't look at what time you started.
We did go a little bit late, so I think we have 20 minutes. Does that sound right?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. That's cool.
Excellent. Perfect. And so we want to look at the individual needs of that survivor or family. Oftentimes, one of the things we're seeing is not only the trauma in terms of the domestic violence, and I think this is where the beauty of art comes in, because it can connect on a cultural or racial or ethnic level. It can connect in terms of community and feeling a sense of identity. That often what we're seeing is the impact of not only trauma from intimate partner violence, but trauma from historical and generational trauma. Whether that's in terms of being an involuntary immigrant, of being a voluntary immigrant, and the trauma of acculturation and acclimation, the ways that there's internalized oppression, being silenced because of identity, not being able to come forward, not being believed, right, because you're a survivor with a disability or because you're a queer survivor. So having those other layers that are there. And I think it's important for us to be comfortable in terms of using language and talking about racism or ableism, or the ways that that sentiment, or the ways that a partner may have used your identity and vulnerabilities around your identity to keep you silent. And I think the Windows workshops really bring that forward, right? Because what each person is creating in front of them has such an ability to connect to their own experience and their own identity. And the more we give that choice and flexibility and safety around running the workshop, we're able to bring this into the mix, right? To say your whole self is welcome here, right? Every part of you can be engaged in this process, right? And I've often found in sharing at the end, being able to open up and give people a chance to give feedback, something special you noticed about someone else's work or something like that. And one of the things that happened for us was also looking at facilitators, right? Were we as facilitators mirroring the multiple identities of people in our groups, right? So that if we were in group and using ASL translation, did we ever have a facilitator that identified as hard of hearing or deaf, right? So looking at those sorts of things, that our facilitators are mirroring the folks that are in groups so that those identities are also validated. We also have to think about the fact that oftentimes the types of curriculum we're using or the ways that we're looking at things speak to sort of a single trauma rather than multiple traumas over time. And we're looking at that very chronic arousal. And we want to think about the ways that if someone has been consistently disempowered, right, even previous to that intimate partner violence, right, that we are sitting in that workshop with not only the intimate partner violence trauma, but that previous oppression, and being able to acknowledge that this is a space for all of that, right, that is something that someone carries, and it's not a weakness, it's not what caused, right, the targeting, right? And I think it's important for us to understand sort of in that trauma-informed model that no one ever is addicted to trauma. No one is ever, I think these are some of the theories, right, that kind of come out in terms of the ways that it can be internalized, that this is just what happens in my life or in my family or in my culture. And I know so many survivors, before they get to us, have gone to, I feel entitled here on my colleagues, because I train them sometimes and they say these things, well, that's just how things are in their family, or that's just how things are, you know how they are in your culture, or, you know, people have heard these things, right? And so it's important for us to really think about how do we help to build a positive sense of identity that says trauma is not normal or regular for anyone. It is chosen by abusers and perpetrators who choose to violate, who choose to cross boundaries, who are making a choice to continue to perpetrate violence in our lives, and who targeted you not because of something within you, but because of something within them, right? And that we can continue to give that message. It's also important for us to also look at the issues around violence against women, sexual and gender-based violence, gender identity, and look at the context, right? How were people silenced in particular? Some of the ways that we used a group called Tunnel Books was to look at the sort of chapters of identity in folks' lives. And we actually had a group that was about half women that identified as queer and about half women that identified as straight. And we did a tunnel book where folks were looking at their identities in terms of their coming out process, and that many of them were targeted during their coming out process with a partner who was abusing them during that process because they knew they couldn't come forward to their family about their relationship, right? And so, and for the straight women in the group, it was a chance to have that empathy around the fact that they had never had to think about that piece, right, because of heteronormativity, but it also gave an opportunity to look at what was the silence and the secrecy for them, right, and how very much there were similarities in that, right? Targeting in two different ways and different identities, but building that empathy and trauma-informed care for one another. And so we were really able to use that for past, present, and future. We did kind of the idea of my identity before the relationship, my identity within the relationship, and my identity, what my identity is becoming after this relationship, right? What do I want to incorporate? So when we think about trauma-informed emotional support, some of the ways that I think are important in terms of things that we can say and do within a workshop is to think about that idea of building safety right from the beginning. And it's something that all of the Windows groups, the outline and the ways that we get folks ready for the group, whether through journaling or relaxation or a check-in, all of those things are beautifully written in a way that create that sense of safety. And so what you can do is also adapt with who do I know is in group today? And what are some of the things that have been either coming up for those folks? What are some of the ways that I know they're already triggered? Are we coming out of a house meeting that was really intense? You know, what's been going on in our shelter? And really incorporate that into this idea of building safety. Maybe our building safety that day and during relaxation, we want to focus on maybe a certain word, maybe community, right? What would real community look like in our shelter? What would that be to feel safe and to feel a sense that other people are trying to understand what you're going through and that you're doing the same for them? What would authentic communication look like, right? And so the importance of trust and checking for that safety, right? Are folks able and ready to embark, right, on something and giving them a choice of what parts or none of the activities, right, that they're able to do that day, and knowing that that's still a safe space for that person to be. To normalize and validate feelings and reactions, and one of the things that I think has a really major impact on that is sometimes talking about or even having a portion or a beginning exercise that incorporates information about trauma and about triggers. And we know that there are lots of ways that each of the groups incorporates some of that. But we can do that in terms of just normalizing and validating within the group when people are having reactions. Explaining trauma and the trauma response, the response and dynamics of sexual assault and domestic violence. And I think some of the ways that we, when we're creating and the themes that we're creating around, have that double impact, right, of the psychoeducation, giving that information, giving information that debunks the myths around DV and creates a safe space to start to talk about how they were impacted. And to give those empowerment statements, right? that what we know is that while it's not true that just time will heal trauma, trauma is something that has to be actively worked on, but that each and every person that has the courage and the creativity to be there with us is already taking many of those first steps on that path, right? That's the good news, and I think that's important for people to understand. Being there in that group is already a part of that process, no matter what it is they create or how that looks, and being able to come from a place of, let's give it a try, right? And if that doesn't feel safe, let's just be in the space together, right? Doing the psychoeducation, as I said, and giving facts around trauma, as well as thinking about what those coping strategies are. And I think a lot of times, many of the things that we utilize are the collage that comes out, or the words that are there are going to give information about how that person coped, right? How did I get through? What were the things I was doing to deny, or to numb out, or to just survive? And that we want to approach those things as non-judgmentally as possible, right? That to let people know that that was creative and adaptive, and even if it's something now that you think maybe is not, that you wouldn't like to continue, that isn't the healthiest choice for your life anymore, we can look at that and understand that you were doing the best you could in a horrible situation, right? That you were responding normally and actually adaptively to something that so many people couldn't even begin to understand, let alone get through, right? So I think if we can continue to give that sort of feedback during our Windows workshops, it's a perfect sort of complement to the creation process. And then, of course, resources and information, and giving folks options, right? Really options about how to create. I know there was a survivor that came routinely to our Windows groups at the Rape Crisis Center, and for probably the first 5 times she joined us, she didn't create. She didn't utilize any of the things, and in fact, she was a survivor that lived with a disability, and she would sometimes need to stand in the corner of the room because of the back issues that she had. And so we talked about that, right? The accommodations that she needed, and the impact that it had for other people to have someone sort of in the room. It was like, well, are they attending, or are they watching us, or what's happening, right? Again, we wanted to mitigate the losses and the change for folks that were sitting at the table and were doing the art process, and we wanted to also make it a safe space so that 5 times later, she became someone who was fully involved and got so much out of the group. But if we hadn't made a space that was safe enough, that said, it's triggering for you to sit at the table with everyone else, because that was when her father, who was both the perpetrator of domestic violence and her sexual abuse and her sister's sexual abuse, would kind of pontificate on high, right, with all of his power. So sitting at a table there with everyone else felt like a huge trigger. And what happened was, once she started creating, that started to come out in her sharing process at the end. And it was really empowering to see other people in the group say, good for you for not sitting down at the table then. That was fighting back. That was you being strong and saying, he doesn't have power over me anymore. And it was incredible, right, to see folks who at first were like, why does she get to stand in the corner? And that were triggered by that, to be able to see our modeling of each person is choosing, how they can feel safe in the room. Each of us may move closer or away from what we're doing in a way that feels safe. That's how trauma works, is to give you, we need to give you choices. And because people can stay with that, and we actually, at first we said, okay, so what do we do, right, as a staff, if we start to see some people leave, right? Some folks are going to be so triggered. And what we saw was that each time we modeled that, it actually made more cohesion. It made a sense, and even as new people came into the group, there was a sense that this is a safe place. Wow, look how they supported someone who is doing something I wouldn't do, but everybody's okay here. Everybody is accepted here. And I think that was gave a very strong cue. So specifically, I think what I want to give us here as we end is to think about self-care as a compassionate witness. And I always end with talking about how we need to take care of ourselves. And I know you're doing that today, and you'll get to be a part of the workshop today. I know that's going to be self-care for me. And it's something that I try to do on a regular basis. But some of the things to think about in terms of vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue that can come out. I know we're working in a movement that is short-staffed and underfunded, and absolutely there is not the level of thanks that you all deserve each and every day for what you do. So when we think about vicarious trauma, I think one of the things that happens is we get into a place of emotional self-defense, right? That we need to defend ourselves, we need to think that I wouldn't have done what, why was she making that choice again, or how, here's this person doing the same thing, or how come they're not following through on what I'm asking them. And we start to do sort of that way of defending ourselves that I'm not like, right, the person that I'm serving. It also can start to have a really personal impact, the impact on, our own lives, our own well-being, our eating and sleeping habits, the way that our self-talk, how we're treating ourselves. Are we treating ourselves gently and with compassion, or are we judging everything we do, right? Are we judging the ways that we cope? Because what I find is that I only change the things that are like, that's not the healthiest way to cope, Tiombe. Okay, we need to work on that. If I say, what? Well, there's a probably good reason why I'm doing it that way. This is what I learned, or this is how I've always gotten by. And if I look at it with a lot of concern and curiosity, rather than, that's terrible, that's a bad thing to do, look at what you did, right? Then I can find ways to change it. And I'm probably going to reach out for support, because if I'm compassionate with myself, I'll feel that maybe there are people out there that will be compassionate with me, and that I deserve their compassion, right? And I start to build that team. It also can have, obviously, an occupational impact. And we see this, and we maybe need to make sure we're calling each other gently in our agencies when it has an impact on us, when we are burnout, when we see that we just can't step up one more time, or that we can't just work one more hour, that we're looking at how those things impact us, and that if we're not in good, healthy shape to do this work, we can't be there for survivors, right? And we know that that's what we want to do. So definitely making sure we're taking care of ourselves, looking at our coping skills, how can we continue to refresh and renew coping skills that feel healthy, that feel like they uphold us in the work that we do, knowing that we're not here to rescue or fix anything, right? And I think that's something we always want to reiterate and be aware of, because there is so much power and ability to heal, and it doesn't have to be about rescuing or fixing. And remember that you're having a normal reaction, right? That our reaction even to hearing stories day after day, month after month, year after year, is to have a normal trauma response, to have a very strong normal response to an abnormal amount of stress. Our jobs have an abnormal amount of stress. So it is important for us to really step back sometimes and take stock of that, and to be real about what we need outside of that. I was going to say outside of that 9 to 5. Yeah, right. That's what I say when I'm in training in other environments, not here. Outside of that 9 to 9, or probably more than that. To think about what it is we have to do to keep healthy, to make sure we're attending to our physical and emotional and spiritual health, and to make sure we're getting information and support. I think that's why Windows is such a phenomenal asset. I know when I was a leader, just getting the bulletin and thinking, oh, look at this, look at what someone else is doing, look at how it's changing lives, and feeling that sense of, again, being inspired to do what I was doing at my agency, connecting with other folks, making sure that we are connecting to the staff here at Windows, so that we can be a part of continuing that, right, and knowing that that's going out into the community. And definitely gaining support for yourself in any way, shape, or form you need to, and that's a really important thing to do. So I think that's my last slide.